If you've watched our videos on critical reasoning, then you know the first job when you read an argument is to identify the conclusion. And oftentimes passages would give you hints to help you do so. Sometimes passages used conclusion indicators, words like therefore, hence, or so, to let you know what's coming up after the indicator is the author's main point. Other times passages would use contrast words, words like however, yet, or but. These words were the defining line between what other people think and the author's main opinion. And sometimes we had to look for judgment words, words like should or unreasonable. Words that gave an indication of what's right or wrong, good or bad. And when we are trying to identify the conclusion, one of the big traps is when a passage talks about a conclusion that is not the author's conclusion. For example, in this case, the passage says that many critics complain that her novels are indifferent to important moral questions. Typically, when a passage quotes someone else in an opinion, that is not the author's opinion. Frequently, the author's true opinion comes immediately after the quoted opinion. In this case, the opinion is, this charge is unfair. In other words, the main point of this passage is that some people might think what's highlighted in blue, but I think they're wrong. When we're looking at a reading comprehension passage, in many ways we're looking at a much longer argument. And so our primary goal should be to identify the author's main point or conclusion. To do so, we can use many of the same techniques we used in the critical reasoning passages. Just as we did with critical reasoning passages, we want to be very sensitive to when the author is quoting someone else. This passage talks about how improvements of memory overnight can be explained by the mere passage of time. But there are a couple clues that indicate that yellow portion is not exactly what the author thinks. First, when the author makes this point, he or she begins with quoting these researchers. And then we have this interesting word, claim, which suggests there's a distinction between what someone believes and what might actually be true. We also have this great word, but. And just like we saw with critical reasoning passages, contrast words such as but, or yet, or however, indicate the defining line between what the author thinks and what someone else thinks. And notice how the first sentence contrasts with the last sentence in this paragraph. The last sentence begins with the word but, and once again, whenever we have contrast, that's a clue what's coming up might be the author's opinion. And then the author says that some benefits of sleep for memory must be acknowledged. Notice how no one else is quoted in believing this green point. That's an indication that what we highlighted in green is the author's opinion. We also have this great word must. And must is a great judgment word, essentially telling us that acknowledging these benefits of sleep, that is the right thing to do. And just like we saw with critical reasoning, the part of the passage that talks about what's good or bad or right or wrong is often the author's main conclusion. Not every passage contains an author's opinion. Sometimes a passage is simply reporting the facts. Passages on history and science often go to great lengths to mask how the author truly feels. In these passages, the author can be described as simply presenting or describing or summarizing information. But if the author inserts his or her own opinion, then we'll describe the passage as arguing or defending. When most of us were taught to write essays in high school, we were told that we should state our conclusion as quickly and clearly as possible. In these reading comprehension passages, however, the authors often wait several paragraphs to clarify their position. But if we're able to hone in on key words, we can distinguish the author's opinions from someone the author doesn't agree with. In this case, in the first paragraph, the last sentence says that a criticism so limited may seem bloodless and hollow. Now, bloodless and hollow are definitely judgment words. They give us an indication of what's right or wrong or good or bad. But right before bloodless and hollow, we have this interesting phrase, may seem, which is very different than saying a criticism so limited is bloodless and hollow. The may seem lightens the tone a bit, or suggests that even though it appears bloodless and hollow, there's going to be some future reason that it's actually not. And we see the exact same pattern in the second paragraph. The passage says that severing a work from those who actually read it, it's drastic and therefore disastrous. Once again, we're tempted to think that this is the author's opinion, because one, we have strong opinion words like drastic and disastrous. We also have this great word, therefore, which we've seen in the critical reasoning is often used to indicate a final conclusion. But then we have this word, may seem, which again lightens the tone and sets the stage for the author to describe how these opinions are actually wrong. It isn't until deep in the third paragraph that we actually have the author's formal opinion. And we have this great indicator word, but. Most of the time when you see a contrast word like but or however as the first word in a sentence, that's setting the distinction between what someone else thinks and what the author finally thinks. So here's how the structure of this passage goes. There's a certain kind of criticism, and you might think it's bloodless and hollow. Or you might think it's drastic and therefore disastrous. But I, the formalist critic, I'm only concerned with the work itself. In other words, those yellow opinions about being bloodless and hollow and disastrous don't apply to what the author is doing. All of these distinctions between the author's opinion and someone else's opinion will come to a head when you try and answer the questions for the passage. The toughest questions will ask you to distinguish between what the author would agree with compared to the other critics in the passage. This is going to be especially difficult because your wrong answers are often going to mention key phrases and buzzwords from the passage. So when you read them, they're going to sound very familiar. And you must check yourself. Often go back to the passage and read those portions again to clarify, even though it was in the passage, is that something the author believed or something someone else believed?